I saw him in New York, I don't know, I guess a couple of months ago, and I had a bunch of folks who listen to my podcast get together with me, and we did something called an escape room. And I don't know if everybody in the room knows about those, but in Orange County, you have probably more escape rooms than in any county anywhere in the entire United States. The idea is that in each one of these rooms, there's a different scenario, but the gist of it is you have 60 minutes to escape from the room you're in. And you have to solve puzzles and do things of that sort to get out. And a lot of the folks who went with me, Alex was one of them, a lot of the folks had never done an escape room before, so I thought I would ease them into it by finding the most subtle kind of escape puzzle I could find. It was called Nuclear Annihilation. I am happy to say that with Alex on our team, we escaped nuclear annihilation with a solid, 13 minutes to spare? Amazing! But on a more serious note with Alex, the other day, I saw one of his interactions on Facebook. He posted something, and somebody who, I know people throw the term communist around much too cavalierly, but this particular person, I clicked through and had the hammer and sickle sign all over the profile page, so I think this actually was a communist. And this communist said, yeah, but you hate the poor, right? And I thought, first of all, can't anti-libertarians come up with something original once in a while? Yeah, we hate the poor, that's right, yeah. So Alex responds very generously, hey, why don't you stick around and maybe we'll find something we do agree on. And the person said, yeah, no way. And then Alex is still trying to say, well, perhaps there's something. And then the person somehow uses keyboard characters to draw a middle finger at Alex. And Alex says something along the lines of, hey, I'm still sending you positive vibes because we got too much negativity in this world.
Mr. Rogers.
So I just couldn't help myself. I had to post something sarcastic about this person. I said, well, it's nice to see somebody stop by who's willing to have an open discussion. I had to say it. But Alex, we appreciate you. We need you. Well, I want to build on what Alex just said because he told us about his own journey. And I've talked about my own journey in a number of different venues. So what I instead want to do is ask the question, why is it a journey to become a libertarian or to arrive at the Libertarian Party? I don't hear a lot of people getting up and saying, let me tell you my journey to the Democratic Party, for example. Then I watched, it was nothing like this. I read old issues of Newsweek or something. No one says that. But yet, with the Libertarian Party, there's always, I hate to put it this way, a conversion story that people have to tell. And I'm a sucker for these. I love these. Because there are so many different ones. In fact, just tonight, I don't want to embarrass the person, but I was talking to somebody who maybe a year ago was very much on the left and studying social work and believed a lot of things that people on the left conventionally believe, and now has just suddenly changed his mind. It's very hard, first of all, to find people with enough of an open mind to do that. To be able to say, I was wrong about not just one thing, but my whole outlook on the world. So I, without revealing the person's identity, want to say, hats off to you, sir or ma'am. But I think there's a reason that it takes a journey to become a libertarian. And I think it's a reason that has two dimensions. And one of them is, some of what we argue is a bit counterintuitive. Now, a lot of what we argue is deeply intuitive. A lot of what we argue is basically just moral ideas you learned when you were a kid about not hurting people and not causing physical harm, not stealing, all these sort of basic things. Don't do to other people what you wouldn't want them to do to you. And so it's very simple. But on the other hand, we have to be honest enough to admit that from time to time we do say things that run counter to what you would think. Like, for instance, if you imagine the economy, here we have this amazing lattice work of exchanges, of people buying and selling, of employees, of all different qualities of education and training to produce a practically infinite array of goods using a wide variety of inputs. across a vast expanse of territory, indeed the whole world, the whole International Division of Labor. And it produces all the goods that we enjoy without any surpluses or shortages. Now you would look at that, and you look at the complexity involved, and you would be inclined to think that this would run better if it weren't just left to its own devices. Because doesn't it seem like you would have a so-called anarchy of production, as Marx says, right? If you don't have some guy with a bullhorn shouting out orders at everybody, wouldn't you think this would be chaotic? How could this work? Look at all the moving parts in it. You need to have a few people telling everybody what to do to make sure it all works out. And yet, the paradox is, the more central direction you have, the more chaotic the result. And that is counterintuitive. But that absolutely is the case. And we know that empirically, and we can also know it theoretically, thanks to geniuses like Mises. So that's one thing. We are saying things that it takes a little bit of thinking to say, I wouldn't have thought that, but doggone it, you're right. But the other end of this is also that, frankly, it's not as if as we're growing up, we're being given a dispassionate overview of multiple schools of thought. It's not like there's no bias in the presentation. There's a bias in a particular direction, and it's a pro-state direction. And I would say it's generally a leftist bias, but even more than that, it's just a state bias. It's a coercion bias. It's a we need a guy with a bullhorn bias. So the fact that you learn how a bill becomes a law before you learn how markets work indicates the priorities here. Because markets and the way they work and the way prices coordinate production, that shows how society spontaneously orders itself. Well, we can't have the peons learning that. What they need to learn is you need the bullhorn shouters in charge of them. And so we give them the political model for how society needs to be arranged. And how's that working out? Well, that's resulted in a country, half of which can't stand the other half's guts these days. It's gotten to a point where it's almost unfathomable how much hatred there is in politics. And yet, look at other areas of society outside of politics. Think about music, for example. You don't go to a concert and argue with people about different kinds of music. You go and you all enjoy yourselves together. Or you think about technology and all the amazing new wonders being introduced into the world all the time, and we're all equally delighted about these things. And these companies compete with each other to see which one can please us the most. That's why I like the model of the market, of commerce, of civil society, because there we can all love each other. It doesn't matter what our views on 87 other things are. But once you introduce the bullhorn and the sledgehammer and the hangman, things get ugly. So we're trying to convey this to the general public, but it's to a public, myself included, that was educated in a point of view that's just the opposite of this. I remember being in middle school and early high school, and I remember that social studies textbook, and I remember wondering how anyone could be so thick as to believe in a laissez-faire economy. Don't you see the photographs of the kids working in the mines? It's right there on page 452, for heaven's sake. How do you not know that? And so I thought that more or less settled the question. Or we would hear, look at all these people who worked in terrible conditions, or they had very, very low wages. There's your laissez-faire economy, you libertarian fat cats. And by the way, most libertarians I know are broke. The idea that libertarians are rich, that itself is pretty rich. Most of the big money doesn't want to gamble on the underdog here. So we're just scrapping along the best we can. But anyway, you hear these sorts of things, and you think, maybe we did need government to crack some skulls to get to the bottom of these sorts of problems. But then there are these flashes of insights that the libertarian has, where we realize that, hold on a minute here, maybe the reason that kids had to work and that wages were so low and conditions were so poor was that the societies were so impoverished. Maybe that's what it is. That if you go to any poor society in the world, you'll find exactly the same things. And if you were simply to introduce a law saying tomorrow, no more child labor, $20 minimum wage, and everybody gets a massage during the workday, everybody would be instantly unemployable and people would starve. So maybe there's a little bit more to this. And it turns out that the actual, like for example, I always talk about this, but child labor is a great example. Now, my tax person who's in the room tells me that there are no rules on child labor when it's your own children. This is good for me to know. Oh. I did a promotion earlier this year where I gave away 4 of my books for free. 600 people took me up on this. Guess who packed them up?
Ah, man. How many kids?
See, I can say that, it's no problem, but actually I paid them so well, it was ridiculous. Anyway, but the point is, why has child labor existed since the beginning of time? And why only recently have we begun to move away from it? Or why is it that particular countries tend to have child labor more than other countries? Is it that all the bad parents decided one day we're all going to move to Bangladesh? Or is it that Bangladesh is so hopelessly poor that without child labor they will starve? And even the International Labor Organization, which is as left-leaning as that name suggests, openly says that's why they have it. So of course we don't want it, but simply to say, well, we'll just pass a law against it is almost like passing a law against gravity. It doesn't matter that you don't like it. You can't just pass a law against it. So what do? How do you get to a situation like we have today where children can be educated instead of working in a mine? And the answer is you have a laissez-faire economy where business firms earn profits and they plow those profits back into that firm. And they buy machinery that can produce 10 times as many widgets as before. And this new abundance puts downward pressure on prices relative to wages and increases people's real incomes. There's now greater physical abundance in the economy, and now we don't need the children's contribution anymore. And that's how it happens. So in the US, by the time the government got around to abolishing child labor, it was already 98% gone. Because of the free market, they come along, get rid of the last 2% and say, see, without us, the kids would still be getting their limbs blown off. They do this constantly. It's a constant refrain. Oh my goodness, look at the OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health thing. Look what happened. After we instituted that, we saw workplace fatalities and injuries plummet. But what they don't ask, and they don't ever bother to ask, is what was the trend before OSHA? That trend was already existing. If anything, it was slightly slowed after OSHA. It was already going on. So then the government comes along as the Johnny-come-lately and wants to take credit for an already existing trend. So this happens again and again. So naturally, unless you're focused on politics and political ideas 24 hours a day, you're probably just going to assume to yourself, because it seems sensible enough, without state involvement, all these terrible things would happen. So it's hard to undo these assumptions. Now, it wasn't like my teacher got up and said to me, this is because of the free market. She didn't have to. It just seemed obvious there was no government involvement, and we all know the government is looking out for our well-being, and so that's what happened. Or there are words that when we hear them, before we have the libertarian epiphany, they're soothing to us. Like, I can almost feel myself on a river. Regulation. It's just so soothing, comforting. It sounds like it's more orderly now. It's all regular. Regulation, right? That's one of these words. And the thing is, it doesn't, when you actually, like for example, I wrote a book on the financial crisis in 2009 called Meltdown. And I wrote it because I knew what any of us in this room knew at the time. We all know how they're going to explain this one. Well, we didn't have enough regulation. Oh my gosh, can you surprise me once in a while? Not enough regulation. Yeah, we only had 115 state and federal institutions regulating the financial sector. We needed 116, and then we would have licked this thing. So I wrote a book talking about, well, there is a little small, minor, inconsequential institution called the Federal Reserve that might have had a teensy-weensy role in this. So I wrote that. It did very well. I was glad about that. But I get this to this day. I mean, on Twitter, from people who've never met me before, they say, don't you know deregulation caused the financial crisis? And I feel like, If only I could be Alex Merced at a time like this.
So where did you hide the body?
Just makes me crazy. So I wrote another one of my ebooks recently to track this one down. But look, just to give you a quick example, because nobody at a dinner event at Cuba Libre wants to hear about bank regulation, but I will say that in the United States, all they can do is tell us about all the bank panics we had before the Fed. Oh, look at all these bank panics we had. All right, I'll grant you there were some bank panics. There were, let's see, the worst of them in 1893 amounted to the depositor losses in the amount of 0.1% of GDP. It's true that we had these panics. In Canada, they had none of these panics. Now, is that because Canada had more bank regulation in the 19th century than the US did? Canada had less bank regulation and no panics whatsoever. In fact, the key thing was they did not have a crippling regulation that the US had called unit banking laws that said you can only have one branch. You cannot have, not only interstate, you can't have a second office. So the banks are all extremely undiversified and fragile. So yeah, they tend to have panics. Canada didn't have that. Canada sails right through this. No mention of this, of course. No mention of Canada is not to be mentioned. Or in the financial crisis, you say to people, tell me which regulation they got rid of would have prevented the financial crisis. Go ahead. Now, most people are bluffing when they say deregulation caused the financial. It's just, I understand why they believe it. Like, I don't want to ridicule people. I get why they believe it. It seems like everything went wrong, so shouldn't it have been the case that if we had been able to crack some more skulls or have more rules, we could have been able to stop this? I mean, I get the thinking. But you ask them, okay, which regulation was it that you wish we had back? 80% of people will say, hey, look over there, and then they'll run away. I guarantee you they're bluffing. The 20% will talk about something called Glass-Steagall, but I will refer you to my new ebook for the answer to that. I actually have an ebook called The Deregulation Boogeyman, because it is and my designer for the cover was so brilliant. It's a bank, but the shadow it's casting is like of a man with a mysterious hat. And so it's casting a boogeyman shadow. And I thought, oh, that's really good. I would never have thought of that. But the long and the short of it is even this has nothing to do with the financial crisis. Nothing whatsoever. But again, it's a natural inclination to just assume that the state, which is looking out for our welfare, must have had some way to stop this. And they must have been crippled in this by bad people who irrationally hate the state. And when you point out to them, we had a ton of regulators. None of them, I mean, who is the primary regulator of the banking system? The Federal Reserve. Would you like to go back and look and see what Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke were saying about housing in the years leading up to the bust? It's smooth sailing. Lending standards are robust, said Ben Bernanke. Lending standards are robust. Okay, you could be barely clean to life with one limb and they give you 5 properties, but lending standards are robust. We got it. So it turns out that in fact it was a government failure and a central bank failure. But it's hard to see that when you're wired to look in the other direction. So it's hard, in other words, to get people to see that things run themselves in ways that are quite marvelous and that are not intuitive at first. And so it helps maybe to give some examples like the English language. There was no person who just woke up one day and said, all right, come on over here, folks. We found a bunch of new objects, and I'm now going to tell you what the words for them are going to be. It doesn't go that way. It's not like the dictionary companies like produce English or regulate English. They just codify our common usage that just emerge spontaneously. Or an academic discipline like physics. There's no physics czar in a lab coat and a hat who's in charge of physics. Physics is extremely decentralized. It operates with academic journals that regulate themselves by publishing and not publishing. And these things go on around us all the time, and we don't notice them because we're not taught to notice them. We're taught the bullhorn model of society. And language and physics don't fit into that model, so it's not brought to our attention. I promise you I will not belabor the eye-pencil story, because if there's anybody on Earth who already knows that, it's the people in this room. I've never offered to not say something and been applauded for it before. But the point of the story is, look at this marvelous order that comes out spontaneously. So that is tricky. That is tricky. So what we need to do, in effect, is once again fill people's heads with that sense of wonder that we had as children. When we looked around at the world and things were wondrous to us. We were open to seeing the miracles that were around us. And so in this sense, we've kind of come full circle here, because as I said at the beginning, what libertarians believe at heart is kind of what we all learned as children. But what we also share that is frankly childlike is our sense of wonder as we look around at what the human race is capable of doing without the separate class of people shouting through bullhorns. We are still capable of perceiving that wonder. And so in a sense, our task is easy, because all we're really asking people to do is to think through the implications of moral intuitions they already have. But at the same time, it's quite difficult, because once they think through those implications, they see it takes them in very radical directions they might not be ready for. But really and truly, ultimately, what we are urging people to do is to be people their own children would be proud of. When you think about the kinds of things you teach your children, do you ever teach your children, look out for number one, and to heck with everybody else? Is that a general principle in any ethical system you can think of? Or can you think of a major religion of the world that teaches that as one of its precepts? Of course, we all teach you want to be fair and honest and treat people equally. These are the things that we teach. We don't say, well, if there's any underhanded way you can advance your industry, you better grab it. And you better grab it at the expense of all the other industries. Or if there's a way you can get a special privilege against your competitors that unjustly harms them, take it. Is that what you teach your kids? And in fact, if your kids knew that's what you were up to, would you be proud of that? And so, as libertarians, we're challenging people. We're saying, don't vote just out of a short-term estimate of your short-term interests, but think in terms of a long-term outlook, not only of your interests, but the interests of all of society. Now, that is the kind of voting that you would want to teach your children, because that shows you to be the kind of person you want your children to see you as, and you want your children to be. So as libertarians, we are urging you to be the best person you can be, to be moral, not to look to get artificial advantages at other people's expense. Now, when we put it that way, yeah, I know we're up against people who just come right out and say, vote for what's good for the dairy industry. But I have to believe there are Americans out there who agree with us that the best approach has to be the approach we teach our own children. Be good, be decent, be honest, and be fair, and therefore be a libertarian. Thank you.